Bada bing, bada boom. Social Inform Media.
This story comes to us from sctimes.com. And it looks like Minnesota might be taking a step forward to keep extremist officers out of law enforcement. That's a can of worms right there. I mean, who are extremist officers? What about officers that see extremist officers and turn their head and go, I don't see nothing? But the Minnesota Board of Peace Officer Standards and Training, or POST, the Minnesota POST, which licenses state law enforcement officers in Minnesota, approved rule changes that included a ban on officers associating with or promoting the views of extremist hate groups. And who gets to decide what's an extremist hate group? The government. They get to decide. The police departments. They get to decide. The sheriff's departments, the FBI, they get to decide who the extremist hate groups are. My point is, some may be accurate, some may be just a political ploy. You decide. But Mendota Heights Police Chief and Chair of the board, Kelly McCarthy, after the board voted unanimously to adopt the new rules, said, "Good work, everybody. This was 4 years in the making." So it wasn't since 2020. It was before 2020. 4 years in the making. That would be like 2019. What happened in 2019? I'm trying to think. I know something happened. The sweeping rules updates also featured changes to how officers are hired and how the board can take action against officer licenses or police certification. The move by the licensee board comes after a renewed sense of urgency following the murder of George Floyd by then Minneapolis police officer, Derek Chauvin. We know he's been convicted. And while many applaud the decision as long overdue, more potential changes appear to be on the horizon. So they're going to be changing more rules on how officers are hired and licensed. But I guess they expedited this after the murder of George Floyd. Several state and local officials, along with activists and religious leaders, applauded the board's efforts ahead of its approval of the draft rules in December. But a joint letter from the Minnesota Police and Peace Officer Associations and Law Enforcement Labor Services, say that 3 times, expressed doubt about the board's statutory authority to impose certain rules and the scope of the changes, as well as concerns about how the rule changes would affect the local agency's ability to discipline their own officers. Basically, the bottom line is, can you really, we'll use the word discriminate, against a law enforcement applicant simply because he's associated with MAGA or the Proud Boys or whatever? Say, well, you know what? You're associated with what we think is an extremist group. Could that come back on them in civil court as discrimination? And if they discover that there's already an officer in a department that meets this criteria, can they discipline him, or can the union say, no, you're discriminating? Now, critics of the proposed changes argued that the Post board doesn't have the authority to limit the freedoms of speech and association of officers while off duty. They're in. That's what I was talking about, see? Well, what are you discriminating against me? Because you're limiting their freedoms off duty. But the administration law judges disagreed, citing a 1995 decision by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit, which the panel found the discipline of a Little Rock police officer who wore blackface to a Halloween party did not violate his constitutional rights of free speech. So if these officers or these applicants say something on Facebook or Twitter or whatever, and they say, extremist group, you're promoting an extremist group, could that be limiting their free speech in a way that's unconstitutional, and thus and therefore this is going to be a very difficult rule change to enforce. You following me? I think it's clear as mud. It goes down a little farther. I don't want to keep harping on this, but bottom line is Minnesota, the state licensing board post is saying, look, if we think you're part of an extremist group or promoting an extremist group, forget it, you're not going to be a cop. Is that a violation of their constitutional right to free speech?